The sun had barely risen over the Persian Gulf on the morning of August 2, 1990, when the first Iraqi Republican Guard divisions crossed the border and began racing south on the desert highway toward Kuwait City. By the time most of the world woke up to the news, the tiny emirate had already fallen, its royal family fleeing by helicopter and car, its oil fields now under the control of a dictator who believed the West would do nothing. He miscalculated badly. Within hours, President George H.W. Bush was on the phone with allies around the globe, and within days, the largest military coalition since the Second World War began to assemble under a single banner, the unconditional liberation of Kuwait. And among the thousands of tanks, jets, and soldiers that poured into Saudi Arabia in the coming months, two of the most improbable warriors of all were steaming at flank speed across two oceans, the United States Navy battleships USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin. 45-year-old relics of a bygone era that were about to prove that thunder still had a place in the age of precision. Imagine for a moment standing on the bridge of USS Missouri as she rounds the Horn of Africa in January 1991, her four massive screws churning the Indian Ocean into white foam, her 9 16-inch guns still wrapped in cosmoline from nearly 4 decades of sleep. She is longer than 2 football fields, displaces more than 57,000 tons fully loaded, and carries armor thick enough to stop almost anything that existed when she was launched in 1944. Yet perched on her aft deck sit sleek white canisters that housed Tomahawk cruise missiles, capable of flying 500 miles to strike a specific window in Baghdad. On her superstructure spin radars that were science fiction when her keel was laid, and below decks 3,000 sailors, some of whom were not even born when she last fired in anger over Korea, work alongside computers that guide weapons their grandfathers could only dream of. She is a living paradox, a floating cathedral of steel, built to fight Imperial Japan, now reborn to face a desert army, armed with Soviet tanks and French missiles. And she is not alone. Her sister, Wisconsin, follows a few weeks behind, carrying the same impossible blend of 1940s brute force and 1980s electronics, plus 8 small drones that look more like radio-controlled model airplanes than instruments of war. Together, they represent the last gasp of the battleship age, and they are sailing straight into a battlefield that should, by all rights, have made them obsolete. To understand how these two gray giants found themselves steaming toward the Persian Gulf in the winter of 1990-1991, we have to go back nearly a decade, to a time when the Cold War still cast its long shadow over the world, and Ronald Reagan sat in the Oval Office dreaming of a navy so large it could fight the Soviets on every sea at once. In 1981, the new president ordered the United States Navy to grow to 600 ships, and someone dusted off the plans for the 4 Iowa-class battleships that had been quietly resting in reserve since the 1950s. New Jersey had already been reactivated in 1982 and sent to pound Lebanese hillsides, and now it was Missouri's turn. In the spring of 1984, she entered the Long Beach Naval Shipyard looking every bit the tired veteran, her teak decks gray with age, her anti-aircraft batteries a forest of obsolete 40mm and 20mm guns that had once filled the sky with lead over Okinawa, but were now useless against supersonic jets and sea-skimming missiles. Over the next 2 years, welders and electricians swarmed over her like ants, ripping out miles of old wiring, tearing away the light anti-aircraft guns, and installing in their place 4 quadruple launchers for Harpoon anti-ship missiles,
8 armor box launchers for Tomahawk cruise missiles, and 4 Phalanx close-in weapon systems that looked like R2-D2's angry cousins and could spit a wall of 20mm tungsten at anything that came too close. Her radar screens glowed green with new SP-Q9 fire control sets. Her engines received new fuel pumps and reduction gears, and her magazines were modified to carry missiles instead of only powder and shell. When she recommissioned on May 10, 1986, Captain Lee Kuhn stood on her bridge and told the assembled crowd that the Mighty Mo was back, and this time she was bringing the future with her.
Wisconsin followed in 1988, emerging from the same grueling refit with all the same upgrades plus one crucial addition: a detachment of 8 RQ-2 Pioneer unmanned aerial vehicles, boxy little drones with a wingspan of barely 17 feet and a television camera in the nose. For decades, battleships had relied on float planes or helicopters to spot the fall of shot beyond the horizon. Now Wisconsin could launch a drone from a tiny platform on her fantail, fly it 30 miles inland, and watch the feed live on screens deep inside her armored citadel while her 16-inch rifles adjusted fire in real time. It was the perfect marriage of 1940s firepower and 1980s eyes, and it made her uniquely deadly in ways no battleship had ever been before. But long before either ship would fire a shot and anger against Iraq, they had already been blooded in the strange half-wars of the late Cold War era. Missouri spent much of 1987 and 1988 escorting reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers through the Persian Gulf during the so-called tanker war phase of the Iraq conflict. Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats, the famous Boghammer cigarette boats packed with machine guns and rocket launchers, loved to swarm the slow-moving tankers, and Missouri's new 25mm Bushmaster chain guns and 40mm grenade launchers proved ideal for swatting the tiny attackers long before they became dangerous. For 108 straight days she remained at sea without pulling into port, the longest continuous deployment of any battleship since World War II. And her crew learned what it meant to fight in the Gulf's brutal heat while escorting ships that flew the American flag only because Washington had agreed to protect them. By the time she returned home in 1989 for the massive Rim of the Pacific exercises, even pop star Cher wanted a piece of the action. Missouri sailors still grin when they remember filming her If I Could Turn Back Time video on the ship's forecastle, the singer straddling a 16-inch gun while the crew tried very hard to look professional. Then came August 1990, and everything changed. When Iraqi tanks rolled into Kuwait, both battleships were ordered to prepare for war, with a speed that stunned even their captains. Missouri, already scheduled for routine maintenance in Long Beach, had her overhaul cut short. Welders worked around the clock to finish installing the last of her Tomahawk launchers, while ammunition ships loaded her magazines with a mix of old-fashioned 16-inch shells and brand-new Block II Tomahawks, programmed to strike Baghdad. Wisconsin, home-ported in Norfolk, received similar treatment. Her drone detachment brought up to full strength, and her crew drilled relentlessly in the Virginia Capes operating area. By December, Missouri was already transiting the Suez Canal, her decks crowded with extra fuel drums and stores for what everyone knew would be a long deployment. Wisconsin followed in January, slipping through the Strait of Hormuz under cover of darkness, while carrier-based fighters flew combat air patrol overhead.
The two sisters had last operated together in the Korean War. Now, 40 years later, they were reunited in the northern Persian Gulf, ready to do what battleships had always done best: bring overwhelming firepower to bear on anything unfortunate enough to be within range. The night the war began, January 17, 1991, belonged to the cruise missile. At precisely 1:40 a.m. local time, Missouri's forward Tomahawk launcher rippled off the first of what would become 28 missiles she would fire during the conflict, each one streaking low over the desert toward command posts and airfields deep inside Iraq. Wisconsin, serving as the Tomahawk strike coordinator for the entire Gulf, orchestrated the launches of dozens more from cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, her combat information center a blur of glowing screens and urgent voices as she directed a storm of invisible missiles that gutted Saddam's air defenses before the first F-117 stealth fighter even crossed the border. For the first week of the war, the battleships were just two more launch platforms in a vast electronic orchestra, but everyone knew their real moment would come when the coalition needed to crack the hardened coastal defenses Kuwait's occupiers had spent months preparing.
That moment arrived on January 29th when Missouri, escorted by the frigate Kurtz, with her experimental mine-hunting helicopter dipping sonar ahead of the battleship's massive bow, nosed carefully into the northern Gulf through waters known to be thick with Iraqi contact mines. At 2:07 a.m., her forward turret fired for the first time in 38 years, the muzzle flash lighting up the horizon like a second sunrise as a 1,900-pound armor-piercing shell arced 19 miles to obliterate an Iraqi command bunker just across the Saudi border. The concussion rolled across the desert and rattled windows in Dhahran, 40 miles away. Over the next month, the two battleships would take turns pounding every target the coalition wanted erased from the Kuwaiti coastline. Radar sites on Bubiyan Island, silkworm missile batteries on Falaka, artillery parks south of Kuwait City, even clusters of small patrol boats that tried to sortie from Qasr, only to be blown apart by 16-inch shells that arrived with no warning and left nothing but burning wreckage. Wisconsin's Pioneer drones became stars of the war, buzzing low over Iraqi positions and sending back live video that allowed gunnery officers deep inside the ship to watch individual soldiers scattering seconds before a shell arrived. One drone operator became famous for flying so low over an Iraqi trench that the defenders emerged waving white bed sheets in surrender. Yet for all their thunder, the battleships were never the true arbiters of naval power in 1991. While Missouri and Wisconsin hurled shells the size of Volkswagens at targets they could see with their own radars, far smaller and less photogenic vessels were proving just how lethal the modern battlefield had become. Out in the dark waters of the northern Gulf, Saudi and Kuwaiti missile boats no longer than city buses prowled with Exocet and Harpoon missiles that could strike from beyond visual range. When Iraqi silkworm missiles rose from the coast, seeking the American giants, it was not Missouri's 5-inch guns that saved her, but the British destroyer HMS Gloucester, whose Sea Dart missile reached out from miles away and casually destroyed the incoming threat. And on the night of February 24, when coalition planners executed one of the greatest deceptions in naval history, it was the battleship's very visibility that made them perfect decoys. For weeks, Missouri and Wisconsin had loitered deliberately off the Kuwaiti coast, conducting leisurely bombardment runs while amphibious ships practiced landing drills far to the south. Saddam, remembering Normandy and Iwo Jima, became convinced the main Allied assault would come straight onto the beaches his engineers had turned into a nightmare of mines, obstacles, and fire trenches. He shifted entire divisions to face the sea, weakening the western desert where the real blow would fall. While Missouri fired star shells that turned night into day, and her drones buzzed overhead like angry hornets, thousands of Iraqi conscripts huddled in bunkers waiting for Marines who never came. Instead, the hammer fell far to the west, where 7th Corps and the French 6th Light Armored Division punched through undefended sand like a hot knife through butter. By the time the ground war ended 100 hours later, the Iraqi army had been annihilated, and the greatest amphibious assault that never happened had helped make it possible. In the end, the numbers told only part of the story. Between them, the two battleships fired 1,128 16-inch shells and 58 Tomahawk missiles, destroyed dozens of coastal targets, sank or crippled more than 15 Iraqi naval vessels, and helped pin down entire divisions that might otherwise have opposed the lightning advance through the desert. Yet even as Missouri steamed home to a hero's welcome in April 1991, the world already understood that her kind would never fight again. The Soviet Union was collapsing, the 600-ship Navy would remain forever unfinished, and budget analysts in Washington were asking hard questions about ships that required 3,000 crew each, when a single Arleigh Burke destroyer with 300 sailors could carry 96 missiles and strike twice as far. Wisconsin fired the very last battleship salvo in history on the morning of February 28, 1991, then turned south for the long voyage home. 7 months later, she was decommissioned for the final time, followed by Missouri in March 1992. The era that began with HMS Dreadnought in 1906 had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet lowering of the ensign over 2 museum ships. Today, you can walk the teak decks of USS Missouri in Pearl Harbor and stand exactly where Emperor Hirohito's representatives signed the surrender document that ended World War II. Then turn around and see the launch canisters that once held Tomahawk missiles pointed toward Baghdad. You can climb into the same director tub on USS Wisconsin in Norfolk, where spotters once watched shells fall on Korean hillsides, and then look aft to the tiny platform from which drones flew over Iraqi bunkers 50 years later. They are monuments to an idea that died between 1945 and 1991. That sea power was ultimately about the biggest guns and the thickest armor. The tiny terrors that replaced them, missile boats, drones, submarines, and stealth aircraft, rarely look impressive in photographs, but they have inherited the oceans in ways the old battleship captains could scarcely have imagined. The thunder of broadsides has become Usean echoes, replaced by the near-silent whoosh of a missile leaving a vertical launcher at 3 times the speed of sound. And somewhere in the quiet halls of those 2 great ships, the ghosts of admirals past nod in understanding, because they finally met the future, and for one brief, glorious moment in the Persian Gulf, they made it blink.